What is going on? So we have a very special stream for you today because this is the first time I'm going to attempt to play a From Software game, or any game actually, while also talking to somebody um, who goes by the name of Kinda Funny Rhetorician, who's actually, thankfully offered to appear on the stream. No. And now I need to figure out how to do it all with everything actually working and, nothing messing up. So, I'll see if we can get him on chat.
Hello?
Hello.
Oh,
Kinda Funny Rhetorician, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad. You are live on the
Awesome.
stream, yeah. And I'm gonna try and figure it out. I think you might be a tad quiet, but I can sort that out on my end. Don't worry. Um, yeah.
Am I better now?
Yes, you should be better now. I don't want you being overshadowed by the sound of me dying in Elden Ring.
No worries. I understand. I totally
Yeah.
get it.
um, cool. Hello, Brennan. We got our first person in chat, which always uh, assuages my anxiety that I've messed things up and put the wrong stream key in or something. But anyway, how are you doing?
I'm good. I am. Now that I'm a doctoral candidate now, so I've just been spending the past like 3 weeks applying to jobs. I'm currently applying to a job in Australia, so we'll see how that goes.
Oh,
That's all
okay.
I.
So you're a doctoral candidate. When you say you've just become a doctoral candidate, is that the case?
Yes, I defended my dissertation proposal like I want to say the third week of the summer. So I defended it over third week of the summer, and yeah, that was pretty much the last step for me. So now I'm all but dissertation.
Oh, amazing. Okay. Sorry, I'm just faffing over here. I'm just closing my blinds and stuff because I've got horrible
No
glare.
worries.
I'm going into a very dark area on Elden Ring, so I need to make
Yeah, no
sure I
worries.
can see. Okay, right. So you still got the whole PhD process in front of you.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I just have to finish my dissertation, which I hope to finish over the fall, and then just turn it in like basically when the spring starts, and then I just graduate on time and go teach.
Oh, okay. That's pretty awesome. I mean, as somebody who's done a PhD, I wanna be like, and you've probably had this before. I wanna be like, yeah, it's gonna be completely amazing. But I feel a bit
Yeah.
like you know the characters on Dark Souls 1, the first NPCs you encounter.
Yes.
And they've all
Yes.
given up and they're all like laughing
Yeah.
maniacally when you speak to them. I feel very much
Yes.
like that's me right now. As you,
Yeah. Yeah.
you've
No,
yeah.
that no, our fields are very different, but yes, yeah, I totally, I concur. I concur very much. I might be hollowing as we speak. It's okay. I get it.
Yeah,
The
absolutely.
hollowing hasn't stopped.
Yeah. It's no, look, it's not. It's just it's a very lengthy project, isn't it? And it's obviously
Well,
it comes with
and
a lot
also,
of great positives, and also some challenging times as well, right?
yeah, and then honestly, the doing the dissertation isn't even the hardest part. It's doing the
Oh, okay.
dissertation.
Yeah.
It's doing the dissertation uh with your department regulation, not like regulations, but like deadlines. So like I learned last year that apparently in order to graduate on time, you basically have to in my department, you have to have your dissertation done by like February of the spring
Hmm.
semester, which is insane. Um so that means you basically have to have your dissertation done by the fall. And then basically have it ready turned in once the spring starts, which
Oh my
is
god.
yeah, it's insane.
Wow.
um Yeah.
That sounds pretty strict.
Yeah, I just learned about this like 3 days before I left my school for the summer.
Yeah, yeah. That's one of the more intense PhD programs I've heard about. To be
Yeah,
honest with you, but you know, at least it will get your ass into gear.
yeah. I'm hoping to get some chapters done over the summer and then just finish it over the fall, and then never think about. Well, not never think about it because I want it to be in a book.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
that's
Yeah.
the goal.
Yeah. So I mean, what we want to talk about really in earnest is your actual dissertation topic, right? Your dissertation itself, and what you're doing it in. So it's in you specialize in like rhetoric, right? Communication, I should say.
Yes.
So could you give us a
Yeah.
little bit of background on that?
Sure. I might have to ramble a little bit because that's actually more of a convoluted question than you might realize. So basically, so my degree is titled Communication Studies, but our field has, I guess, for a lack of a better term, we have different camps. So we have quantitative people, so people who do stats, so that probably be like down your area. So people who will do typically like surveys and do statistical analysis on how people communicate, particularly the way most people who do that would probably be in the health communication field. So people will study how like doctors communicate with their patients and so on. Then you have more qualitative analysis, which these are typically what we would call like ethnographers, um, and people who will do interviews or so on. And then there's me, rhetoric. So rhetoric and rhetorical theory are kind of more on like the philosophy side of communication studies, but it has a very very odd history. So firstly, or rhetoric started I mean long like during the era of the sophists, right? But then you had Aristotle who wrote his book about rhetoric, just literally called Rhetoric, right? And it's a pretty boring book if anyone's read it. It's pretty boring. It's like it kind of it's because the way Aristotle kind of saw rhetoric was to look at rhetoric more as a practical tool rather than something that's supposed to be very theory heavy. So if you read his book Rhetoric, it'll be things that like you've thought like you can think of without even reading it. Like how do you exploit someone who is prone to envy? How do you persuade someone into believing or siding with you who has tendency to be envious or whatever, right? Like he kind of like sets out like really basic parameters and how do you use them to persuade others. So generally, from an Aristotelian perspective, rhetoric is just the study and the act of persuading other people, right? And for the longest time, that's pretty much what all rhetoricians did was ethos, pathos, logos with Aristotle. Like, oh, this speech was good because it had ethos, pathos, and logos, and maybe a little bit more nuance here and there. But it wasn't until around World War II, or a little bit after, when we started getting people like Kenneth Burke. So Kenneth Burke got popular right after World War II in America, where he published a book called The Philosophy of Literary Form. And it's basically just a collection of long and short essays that he wrote about various rhetorical things and obviously the literary form. But the chapter that he's most known for is called The Rhetoric of Hitler's Battle, where he basically does a rhetorical analysis on Mein Kampf, and how Mein Kampf basically constructs an apocalyptic anti-Semitic worldview that justifies the Holocaust, basically. Um, and so that's where all of a sudden we started changing from Aristotle to not just Kenneth Burke, but we started incorporating things like philosophy and theory. So now my field has become much more theory heavy. I can give you like an example of a paper that I'm working on right now. So I am working on a paper where I'm examining the apocalyptic rhetoric of conservative media's or coverage of critical race theory. And basically, so apocalyptic rhetoric is I don't want to say new. It's actually fairly old because Kenneth Burke obviously talked about it when he analyzed Mein Kampf. But in terms of analyzing apocalyptic rhetoric within paranoid conspiracy theories, that's something that most rhetoricians haven't really touched. So what I do is I incorporate theory from the likes of Slavoj Žižek, or Sniffy Boy, as we sometimes call him. And I also include people like Hegel, Lacan, and so on, right? So what I do is I kind of put down these philosophical theories and incorporate them with the rhetorical literature of the apocalypse to kind of understand how right wing media uh, uh, basically creates an apocalyptic message for conservatives about or surrounding critical race theory. So that's generally what rhetoric does, is that we use theory to kind of understand persuasive messages.
Okay, okay. That's really interesting. I mean, it's that. So, from what you said there, what
Are
kind
you
of
still
caught
there?
my eye? Yes. Am I having problems
Hello?
with audio?
Oh,
Um,
oh I think I. Oh, I can't hear you.
right. Oh, for God's sake. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Say something.
Hello?
Uh, s- yeah, I still can't hear you. I can hear you on the stream. I can't hear you on Discord for some reason.
YouTube hears both. Can you? They can hear me on. They can hear me on. They can hear me. Okay, so they can't. Let me just crack Discord. Okay, 1 second. I just like. I don't know. I'm a bit of a noob with this tech, but to be honest with you, like, it's literally the same setup.
Oh, there you
Uh,
are. There you are.
hello.
You
What? Okay. Right.
there
So
you are.
to clarify to everybody, because even the streamers didn't see that, what I just did was I already had the correct mic selected there, and then I just clicked on that same option again, and now suddenly it works. So there you go. That's
Oh,
apparently
wait, leftist audio. We already know.
leftist
We
audio.
know.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I don't know. People are saying I'm only in their left ear, which I really don't understand because again, like there's nothing has changed since last stream when I wasn't only in people's left ear. But I think we're gonna have to make do with that for now because basically I'd rather be in people's left ear than
And the right one.
than the right one. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's obviously the yeah exactly.
Literally leftist audio.
Leftist audio, yeah, exactly. So sorry. So what I was trying to say to you was it. So that was a really interesting history of rhetoric and the discipline. I mean, um, it sounded a little bit like people had been a bit stuck in the past in that discipline for a while.
That I can't express to you how, like, what you just said actually understates how correct what you just said was. Like you're not just correct, you're more correct than you think.
Wow. Okay.
Yes, like we were like rhetoricians were basically only using Aristotle until like the 1950s. And even then we really didn't break from and even then Kenneth Burke really didn't like break ground in my field until Edwin Black when he came up with the second persona where he criticized Aristotle for prioritizing the speaker and never incorporating the audience.
Yeah.
Um, and so, but that was like in the 1980s or like
Mm.
either late 70s or early 80s.
So why do you think, what kind of happened there? Because I mean, one of the things that I sort of, in economics, right, one of the things I often have a go at economists for, one of the many things, is like not appreciating past thinkers. But there's also a bit of a double-edged sword here, because you seem to have this kind of divide between the disciplines that don't appreciate past thinkers and then the disciplines that almost kind of lionize them and just defer to them, right?
Yes.
And so, like, yeah, I mean, how do you think that kind of happened?
I so how do I, so basically so rhetoric was often looked at as like a super practical thing. Even Aristotle explicitly said in Rhetoric that theory isn't really something that rhetoric is supposed to do. If you're using theory, you need to rely on other fields, but you're not using it to theorize about rhetoric. You're using it to give like the context by which you're using that persuasive message. And rhetoricians basically just took him at heart and have basically only used rhetoric as kind of like an application, like when wealthy kids get like their rhetoric or public speaking teachers, right? So that was all rhetoric was teaching people how to be good at public speaking, right? That was pretty much all rhetoric was about, was like studying ethos, pathos, logos, how to persuade an audience, and so on. But the problem with that, what let the I think part of the reason why people got so fixated was because rhetoric was supposed to be seen as not political, that rhetoric is supposed to be something because it's quote unquote practical. It's post political. It doesn't have any type of um um it doesn't have any political implications. It's just there, right? And that's when in the 1970s we started getting like rhetoricians started critiquing things like ideology, and people like oh god, what was his name? I can't remember. There was a guy who came up with the third persona after Edwin Black. I cannot remember for the life of me his name. It'll probably come up to me at some point. But he came up with the third persona, where it basically saying that we need to incorporate ideology within our rhetorical theory and our rhetorical analyses. And he actually brings up a lot of the conservative responses that he got when he hinted at talking about ideology within rhetorical critique, and they were like vicious, screaming about how like basically like how dare he even think about um incorporating ideology and politics into rhetoric. Rhetoric is just a rigid thing where you apply ethos, pathos, logos, nothing more, nothing less. Don't do anything more than that. And thankfully, that guy won. That we started including ideology with it. When that's pretty much what I do too. Like I don't just study conspiracy theories, right? I study. I conspiracy theories are basically just like a vehicle to understanding rhetoric and ideology. And so that's why I think like we got so obsessed with Aristotle, was because we just wanted to stick with our doctrine. But also the same thing kind of happened with Kenneth Burke. There is I'm not joking. I don't know if economics has this. I'd be based on what I've seen from your videos, I'd be surprised if they didn't do this. But uh there's a Kenneth Burke Society within my field. There's an entire division at multiple conferences in my field where it's just basically a cult of followers who obsess over Kenneth Burke. Um, and so I don't talk with them because uh, they're crazy. So yeah, they're insane. They're absolutely insane. Don't like if you ever like stray away even mildly, um, with Kenneth Burke, they fucking rip you to shreds. Which is weird because Kenneth Burke criticized a bunch of people for using his theory as like a cookie cutter. Um, so yeah, so I guess that's like I know I've been on a ramble, but I think that's like kind of like my short answer of why I think my field became so doctrinaire about its work.
Yeah, I mean, again, like the parallels to economics. Like I said, with economics, it's less that it's any one individual. Um, Although economists do get a bit funny if you do criticise certain individuals, but It's more just like a core set of ideas that economists use, and they really don't like it when you deviate from that set of ideas. And like you said, yeah, they'll just rip you to shreds. So there is an analogy, although it seems to be more about methods in economics. But I suppose it's also kind of about methods in rhetoric. So yeah, I mean, you said you work on conspiracy theories.
Yes.
So I mean, it seems pretty clear that you don't think that there can be a separation between kind of the practice of public speaking, let's say, and ideology and politics,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
could you explain your thoughts on that, and like how your work on conspiracy theories relates to it as well?
So so a lot of my work, I use Lacanian psychoanalysis generally as for most of my rhetorical work. And
Can you explain that to those of us who have no idea
so
what we're talking about?
Lacanian psychoanalysis. So it's Jacques Lacan. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I don't know
Hmm.
French. Maybe I don't know if you do, but if I
No.
butchered that, I don't care. It's the French. So basically, Lacan, um, he was a psychoanalysis, like Freud, but if you're honest, it's trying to like God, trying to simplify as best I can with Lacan because he's so complicated. But I think like honest to God, if you want the simplest explanation or thesis, if you want the central thesis of Lacanian psychoanalysis, is that for Lacan, nothing exists, everything is premised upon a centralized void, and language is nothing more than a coping mechanism. And so language is a way for us to overlook what he would call the real. So, for instance, and maybe this would get into like ideology. So there are three components in Lacanian psychoanalysis. You have the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real. So the symbolic would be basically where our identities are located, where language and rhetoric is also located. The imaginary is where the fantasy is, and the real is where the real is, and I'll get to that in a second, right? So the imaginary is where what Lacan called the fantasy, and so the fantasy is kind of like a narrative that we come up with to overlook the inconsistencies and the contradictions within what Lacan called the symbolic order, right? So a good example in America would be an easy one: the American dream. The idea that if you come from the poor and you work really hard and make smart decisions, you'll get out of poverty in almost every case whatsoever, right? That would be considered an ideological fantasy, right? Because what it does is it creates this kind of narrative that it creates this narrative that allows you to kind of overlook the contradictions within the symbolic order. And the real is, to put it very simplistically, kind of the contradiction itself. But there's a little bit more nuance to that within the real. So the real is kind of like it's two contradictory things at the same time. It's kind of like this inert presence while also being an empty vessel. So, so Zizek compares the real to the Hegelian object. So, so explaining this through like Kant and Hegel. So Kant um, he theorized about the thing in itself. For him, everything in the world has a thing in itself. Now, for him, the thing in itself can't be talked about, or like you can't ever truly know or understand or illustrate the thing in itself. It's sublime. It's unrepresentable. It exists beyond representation. However, what Zizek and Hegel would argue is that the thing in itself. So Kant thinks that the thing in itself can't be represented, but he is still presupposing that the thing in itself exists. But what Hegel and Zizek argue is that the thing in itself doesn't exist. The thing in itself exists as pure radical ideology. We presuppose the existence of the thing in itself, and what the sublime experience is the exact failure of the object to represent the thing in itself. So, like the example that Hegel used was the spirit is a bone. Now, the sentence on its own is complete fucking gibberish. What the fuck does that mean? Spirit is a bone. What is this, right? Well, what Hegel and Zizek would argue is that the bone is the sublime object, because what it's doing is that it's trying to presence the spirit. The spirit is supposed to be more than what the bone is, and the bone is a failed representation of the spirit, and that's the sublime experience, right? It's the sublime experience of that failed representation. And so, what was it? So what Zizek argues is that excess, that the spirit, right? The spirit that's supposed to be within the bone, that's the real. It's that which exists beyond the material body, right? The body within the body. And so,
right, okay. So within the bones. So sorry, I'm trying to
yeah,
catch up. So the bones of the human body, right, don't
yeah,
contain a spirit, right?
yeah,
Is that what you're saying, right? They
yeah, yeah,
don't literally
yeah,
contain a spirit.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. They don't contain the spirit, or they don't contain the spirit, but we presuppose that it does, because what the bone does is it's not supposed to actually represent the spirit. It's supposed to make the spirit present, if that makes sense, right? It's supposed to presence the thing in itself, rather than actually represent it, and that's where the sublime experience comes in. It's not it's acknowledging that the thing in itself doesn't exist, but presupposing that it does, and convincing yourself that it does through what Hegel would call a dead object. In fact, Hegel was actually super critical of Kant on this, and he accuses Kant of whitewashing the spirit, like how the dead object, in a way, kind of what was it the dead object is oh god, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. Oh, the dead object is not supposed to it kind of whitewashes the representation. It presupposes causes and effects, and that's where we get into the real, right? So it's supposed to represent the real, but what it ends up doing is it ends up constructing a fantasy that we use to kind of overlook our symbolic order. It does
So
that does that make
the bone makes us indulge in the fantasy of like spirit, right? Is that
Yes.
that's the
Yeah,
issue, and that's a
exactly.
problem. That's a problem for these guys, right? Because I was sitting here thinking, is it not okay, at least in some circumstances, to think of humans having a spirit, and it's obviously not scientific, but like in terms of how we deal with each other and how we view each other, is there not some value to thinking like that at all, or am I misunderstanding them? They're not dismissing
Well,
it completely.
no, yeah, no. What Zizek would argue is that it's kind of inevitable. It's like it's just something that we do. We like that's what Lacan would argue. Lacan would argue that it's just what we do. We don't realize we're doing it. Uh, it's like that's why like the best. That's why I always summarize like the main thesis of Lacan is that language is nothing more than a coping mechanism, that nothing exists. Right. So like basically, spirit is a bone. And so what basically what it is that it's not necessarily saying it's inherently bad, but it's just something that we do. It's more descriptive in a lot of ways, right? It's just this is just what we do. We use objects and language and symbols to represent um as best as we can the thing in itself, right? We've always been in like the situation where I don't know the best word to say this, or I don't know if this is the correct term to say this, but I think you'll get what my general meaning is, and that's what the sublime object is for Hegel and Zizek, that we use these kind of objects to kind of reference larger ideals. Um, to kind of best understand, as we can, the symbolic order that we construct. And that's why Lacan argues that the unconscious, one of the things that Lacan famously argues, that the unconscious is structured like a language. And in the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, Lacan basically argues that with the weak construct, there is the cause and effect, right? There's a cause and effect. This might bode really well for you in economics, right?
Mm.
Because there's a cause and effect, and then there's a gap between those two. The unconscious exists within the cause and the effect, and what I would argue, based on my readings from Lacan and Zizek and Hegel, is that the sublime object is the cause and the effect, and the gap in between the two is the language we use to kind of articulate the cause and the effect. The sublime object is the cause and its effects, and then we construct a language to understand it. And so, what Lacan uses the example of, say, the moon pulling the sea level up, right? So, like when the moon's at a particular location, its gravity pulls the sea levels up. When it's in another location, the sea levels go down, right? And we know this is to be the case, but how do we construct a language to understand it, right? We construct a language to kind of explain that cause, but for all we know, maybe there is another reason for that, and we haven't figured that out. But we presuppose that, right? That's not to say that scientists are wrong, by the way. Just so people don't misinterpret. It's not
Mm.
saying the scientists are wrong. It's that how do we construct language to understand that phenomena, right? And so what we do is we create a language within the cause and the effect of the sublime object, and we kind of take it for granted. And the unconscious is what Lacan would call the what was it the undiscovered, right? It's almost like you created it, but then almost forget that you created it, and it becomes undiscovered. And when you go into the unconscious, you rediscover the thing that you created. Does that make sense?
Okay, so it's like so it's like saying, or one implication of this would be that perhaps different people who speak different languages would maybe have different interpretations of like reality and maybe even of science. Right? Is that right?
Yeah,
What I'm saying?
yeah, yeah. For you, right? For an economist, right? Like I watched your live stream with, I forgot his name. It was the one about post-Keynesian
Oh,
economics.
Joe
Um,
Michelle. Yeah.
yeah, Joe Michelle, yeah, yeah. And because like there were a couple times where you talked about how economists have this habit of acting as if they have no ideology, right?
Mm, yeah.
And I would argue that's part of the unconscious. The language that they use to explain the cause and the effects of their research is is ideological because it's in the unconscious. They haven't discovered the fact that their language was already laid down for them to presuppose as like natural or here's a good example, right?
Hmm.
So Zizek has a really good example. Money. Money would be a sublime object because it's the cause and the effect of our economy. But the thing is, people know, even no, people like I'm not an economist, right? Like most people aren't like particularly good when it comes to economics, right? But
Sure.
we even though most people aren't good with economics, we know that money is just a piece of paper that we assign value to, right? Something we assign value, and it accrues value through very complicated social forces, right? And so it accrues, we know that, right? It's just a piece of paper that we assign value to it, and it accrues value through complex social forces.
Mm.
But then we actually use money when we buy something. And what Zizek would argue, and he argues this in the Sublime Object of Ideology, that basically we act as if money is magical when we're engaging in commodity exchange. We are fetishists in practice, not in theory. So even though we already know that money is like a social construct through so complex social forces, we act as if it is magical when we actually buy something, right? And so the actual commodity exchange would be the unconscious grammar that exists in the gap between the cause and the effect, which would be the money, right? And that's where like I would argue like for economists they're acting as if what they're doing is not political or post ideological, because the language that they're using to explain the causes and the effects is unconscious. It's undiscovered. It's left at it's left bare, external for them to discover themselves. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. So I mean, I guess, well, oh no, I've just been absolutely massacred. So yeah, I guess like there another example. I mean, I'm not sure if it counts. I'm still not 100% sure what a sublime object is.
Oh, I can explain that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, tell
So,
us what a sublime object is.
technically, I've already explained it. So like,
Yeah.
but I haven't said it, right? So remember when I said, so the money is the sublime object. So think of the sublime object. So, because remember, Kant argues that the thing in itself cannot be represented. The sublime experience is the failure to represent the thing in itself. But Kant argues that the thing in itself does exist. It exists somewhere. But Hegel and Zizek say no, the thing in itself does not exist. The thing in itself exists purely as a radical negativity. So what the sublime object does is that it's merely the positivization of pure negativity. So if we go back to the statement, the bone is a spirit, or is the bone is the spirit. The bone is a sublime object because its failure to represent the spirit indicates that it's merely the positivization of pure nothing. The spirit is negative. It doesn't exist. It exists as pure negativity, and the bone is just kind of morphing itself around to fit whatever shape it needs to fit our sense, like fit our communicative abilities. So that's the sublime object. It's like this spectral thing that that is the positivization of pure nothing. The thing in itself for Hegel and Zizek doesn't exist, but we presuppose its existence through some positivization of its nothingness.
Okay. So it's not really there, but we make it there by attaching it to things that actually exist.
Yeah.
And I guess I mean, money. You were talking about money, right? So the question is, and this goes back to what I was saying about spirit, right? The question is when is this useful and when is it not useful? I suppose that is the big question, right?
Yeah.
To what extent is that useful for us as humans to have money, right? And where we, it's just a piece of paper, right? You're right. Everybody knows that money is actually it's just paper, or more these days, more numbers in a spreadsheet or something. But to what extent is that a useful way to deal with the world, or to what extent do we need these things, and when do they lead us astray? And I suppose that's potentially where your stuff on conspiracy theories comes into play, right?
Well, so conspiracy theories are really interesting, right? Because I the way that I kind of look at conspiracy theories is that whether or not a conspiracy theory is correct or batshit crazy,
Hmm.
is gonna is go. I am. It matters less to me because what interests me is not necessarily the rationality, but what does this conspiracy theory and its popularity say about the discourse of today, right? So like QAnon, for example, is a really good example. It's batshit fucking crazy. I don't know how much you know about QAnon. It's batshit fucking Looney Tunes.
Isn't it
Um,
like there's a paedophile ring in a pizza parlor in Washington or something along those lines? I
that
can't remember.
that's Pizzagate, and that did start like that kind of. It technically wasn't part of QAnon, but it kind
Ah,
of adopted itself into QAnon. But
okay.
like the basic tenets are kind of the same. The idea that satanic pedophiles are like kidnapping kids and sexually abusing them and sacrificing them to Satan so they can drink their adrenochrome to live forever. So Hillary Clinton is actually like 3,000 years old because she's been drinking the blood of children for like 3,000 years, whatever the fuck they think on 8chan. Um, so um, so basically, um, even though QAnon is batshit fucking crazy, right? What what's interesting to me about QAnon is not that it's batshit crazy, but that it says something about the political climate that we're in today, right? Even though it's not real and it's crazy, there's some like the fact that it's able to grab the audience that it did indicates that we're in a particular political climate that we've never been in before, right? And it says something about the political climate. I would say the same thing about like more rational conspiracy theories. For instance, like if the people who the black victims in the Tuskegee experiment, right? If they were like, hey, I'm pretty confident the government just kind of fucked me over and left me to kind of like die to syphilis for no reason,
Mm.
right? Like now that would end up being
That's the experiment where they were testing that on African Americans, right?
yeah, like
And
yeah,
they just like testing like something that was really dangerous that obviously wouldn't pass any kind of ethical review for like what kind of drugs can you test on people these days, right?
yeah, exact. Because basically, like they already had syphilis, and they were like, "What can syphilis do, to black people?" And so they gave them treatments, and I'm doing air quotes right now.
Yeah.
Um, uh, uh, they didn't give them treatments. They gave them basically what was effectively a sugar pill. Because the cure for syphilis already existed at that point.
Yeah.
Um, and they basically just waited out and saw what happened with the experiment. And so if a black person in that experiment was like, "Hey, I'm pretty sure I didn't get treated for syphilis. I'm still having the symptoms, and I'm pretty sure the government was part of it or whatever," not they would be right, right? They would be absolutely right.
Mm.
But the rationality of it to me is less interesting because what that to me what that conspiracy theory tells me is that there's something going on within political discourse um, that kind of like it kind of makes us like think about like systemic racism at a discursive level, right? How do we talk about systemic racism, right? So I would argue that the sublime object would likely be racism, right? It's the cause and the effect of the cause and the effect, or no, I'm sorry, blackness would be the sublime object. It's the cause and the effect of that experiment, and the unconscious within it would be racism, right? It would be racism, it would be white supremacy, and so on, because that's the language we use to explain the cause and the effect, right? Because we often whenever we talk about um, systemic racism, what do conservatives typically do, right? The black crime rate, right? And that's not the only one, right? They do a bunch of
Mm.
other stuff, right? Black people, despite making 13% of the population, 50%, blah, 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 1350, right? And what it is that what it does is that it's a way of explaining away, ironically enough, it's a way of explaining away racism through the sublime object of race. So the blackness of the patients becomes the sublime object because it's the cause and effect. It's the cause of their suffering and the effect of their suffering. But what explains it in the middle in that gap is white supremacy, right? It's that unconscious illusion that we don't think about that just kind of happens, right? It's structured a priori to you and I ever being born, right? And so the way that I would look at this to kind of answer your question, which if I went on a ramble, so if I might have forgotten. So if you asked, if I remember correctly, like how useful is this with
Mm.
like money? I would argue that at the end of the day, it's largely inevitable. It's something that we just do.
Mm.
There's no way of kind of getting around this. It's that being it's willing to acknowledge um it's willing to acknowledge that we live through not I don't want to say we live through an illusion because that's kind of cringy. Because Zizek would argue that we don't live through an illusion. He argues the opposite. The illusion for Zizek isn't like this because Marxists, traditional Marxists, would say something along the lines of um uh what was it said something along the lines of that the working class cannot see the exploitation or whatever, the false consciousness, right?
Yes. Yeah.
But what Zizek would argue is that it's actually the other way around. Workers are not dumb. They know that they're being exploited. The illusion isn't that they don't see the exploitation. The illusion is that they don't see how the fantasy structures their reality. The illusion isn't covering them from seeing things the way it really is. The illusion is the reality. right? So they know that the exploitation is happening. What they do is they justify the illusion. They rely on fantasies to explain away that illusion. Here's a really good example. I was actually watching not it wasn't on Vosh's channel, but there's a couple of like Vosh clip channels.
Yeah.
And one of them posted a clip because he when he debated Charlie Kirk on um Tim Pool's show, he watched Kyle Kulinski's debate with Charlie Kirk. And Kyle Kulinski did surprisingly really well. I didn't expect him to do that well against Charlie Kirk, but he actually did really well. Um, and you'll notice that when Charlie Kirk talks, he kind of fungles between two different contradictory positions and doesn't even bother to explain it. The first one is that the Republicans and conservatives are the only ones who are out for the working class American. And then Kyle Kalinske like, okay, then why don't you just tax the wealthy? And he goes, oh, well, are you trying to punish entrepreneurs? Right? You're trying to punish entrepreneurs from giving the good graces of the job market to poor working class. And it's like, man, that's really weird. You claim to be on the side of the working class, but yet you're such a cuck when it comes to the ultra wealthy. And there was a really, 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 really telling moment where Kyle Kalinske said, "Okay, so I'm going to give you a hypothetical. Um, let's say Jeff Bezos is the wealthiest man on the planet, but let's say you had the opportunity to tax like 0.1% of his wealth to end like all homeless vets. Like they're like I think it was like I think it's like 50,000, 500,000. I don't remember. Like there's like an absurd number of like homeless vets in America. And he's like, if you could tax 0.1% of Jeff Bezos's wealth to alleviate the entirety of the homeless vet problem, would you do that? And his response was, well, I hope they would donate their money willingly. And it's like, oh, there we go. There we go. You don't actually believe in what you're saying. You're just saying it because you know it's effective at getting at radicalizing working class people into like far right conservatism, right? It's a fantasy. It's an ideological fantasy. It's using an unconscious language to explain the cause and effect of the sublime object. Sorry, I went a bit on a rant there, but I hope that made sense.
Yeah. Okay. So wait. So just so when we're talking, I mean, I get like the I'm just trying to unpoison myself here. I don't think I've got the right items. I get the you know, the inconsistency in Charlie Kirk's argument. I mean, because I have two brain cells to rub together, I can see that. But
Yeah.
but also the I'm trying to link it to like the you know, the kind of theoretical basis that you've set out, and the sublime object, right? So in that case, and you did say this, I'm not accusing you of not saying this,
No,
I'm just
no, yeah.
a little
You're
slow.
trying, yeah.
So could you
No, I
just
know,
try and
yeah,
link
yeah.
them together for us a bit
So,
more?
like, I would argue that the sublime object would be for Charlie Kirk, because they were talking about the free market and regulation. So, I would argue that the sublime object in this case would probably be the market, the free market
Hmm.
for Charlie Kirk, and the language that he uses to explain it is in the unconscious, right? So, for his case, it would be like basically neoconservatism, right? Like or libertarianism, whatever you want to call it, right? The idea that like the market shouldn't be regulated, that the market should be able to be free to do whatever the fuck it wants,
Mm, mm.
and so on. So I would argue that the sublime object,
Free markets are a sublime object, and they're
yes,
not real. Yeah, okay, so I can definitely get on board with that.
yeah, it's like because what the market is, because like because Charlie Kirk was constantly talking about how the free market represents freedom. How if the
Mm,
free market is where Americans truly get their freedom from. It's from the market exchange. And if we let the market do what it needs to do on its own without any regulation, then the market then people will get their freedom, right? So the market is the sublime object because he's trying to use it to presence American freedom. But American freedom it doesn't truly exist. It's something that we made up, right? It exists as pure negativity. And so what was it called? So the sublime object for Charlie Kirk would be the market, or the free market, as he would put it.
Yeah, okay. But then, so where does the contradiction come from? Does it come from the fact that there's another sublime object that's in conflict with what he's saying? Is that where the contradiction comes from?
The contradiction is that he's being like Kant. He's presupposing the positive existence of the free market. He's presupposing the free market is a thing that just exists in nature, that it's like this thing that if we just dig really deep into its concept, we can get at the core of the free market. That's what the contradiction is. He's presupposing the a priori existence, the positive existence of the free market, not realizing that the free market is just an empty signifier. It's an empty word to gesture at a vague concept that is often defined in very different ways depending on your political ideology, right? And so because you probably see the market very differently from the way that Charlie Kirk sees it, right? You're literally a post-Keynesian.
I see it correctly. Yeah, I mean
Right.
So he's just talking nonsense.
Yeah. Like there are different definitions, and the correct one is yours, post-Keynesian, right? So, but that's the thing, right? Is that's the contradiction with it. It's not just that like he's shifting between being a populist and being a shill. The contradiction is also that he's presupposing that the free market is something that a priori exists, right? So like to him, the free market exists the same way that I'm holding a pencil, that this pencil exists.
Right. Okay. Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, this is the type of thing that's extremely powerful, right? Because I mean, it does often strike me, and I don't know, I'm a leftist, so maybe I'm a bit more critical of conservatives. I'm sure you've got people doing it all the time. I mean, like you said, we can't avoid it. But it does just strike me that something as kind of simplistic as an appeal to the free market, you see it quite a lot on the right, and that's sort of, and I mean, here's one thing. Okay, tell me about this. Right, one thing that really bothers me as a Brit and as a leftist, the two best or worst things to be, depending on who you ask. As a Brit and a leftist, right, when people on the in America, especially on the right, but actually across the political spectrum, appeal to the US Constitution, right, it literally means nothing to me. Like, I don't know. It's not a sublime object for me. It's not even an object. Like, I don't care about it. Like, not except in perhaps the most roundabout terms. I do not understand why Americans are always like, this is the Constitution. We've got to do what the Constitution says, because I don't know. It's just a piece of paper written by a bunch of slave owners in like the 18th century. Like, I don't give a crap about it. I literally don't understand. I understand for procedural reasons why people care about it, and you have to meet people halfway and acknowledge what they care about. I get that in terms of political pragmatism, but for me that seems like a good example of like something that it's an easy win, right, in a debate for, say, Charlie Kirk, and I'm sure he's done this more times than once, to be like, oh, the US Constitution, this violates the Constitution, blah blah blah.
Of course, he's never read it, by the way.
Which is what? Oh my god! Sorry, there's so many bots in my fucking chat, which is really pissing me off.
I'm seeing it. Yeah. Oh wow.
Jesus Christ! What is going on? I've literally banned 3. I literally don't understand why. It's so bad on. I mean, I guess it's not a small channel, but like, chat's not that big. And I don't understand how something called Naked HD XYZ sex dates is allowed on YouTube.
Yeah.
Like, why, if you name your channel that, like, surely the fucking geniuses at Google could maybe sort something out.
Well, you already made one mistake. You just said geniuses at Google. that's your mistake. You made a mistake right there.
Yeah. But sorry, anyway, I was talking about the Constitution.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so is that a sublime object? Am I getting this
Oh
right?
yeah, yeah, it absolutely yeah. Because what it does is like, what is the American identity, right? The American identity is something that it's based on pure negativity, and the Constitution is just the positivization of that negativity, right? And so what the Constitution does is it creates a fantasy, right? It creates an ideological fantasy that helps construct the language that we use to talk. So for Charlie Kirk, what he does, right, is that he has this language that he uses to kind of explain an American identity through his pseudo. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't care about the Constitution either, but at least I understand the fucking Constitution to some extent. Um, but he's like never read it. He's only getting his talking points from I don't know, fucking Dennis Prager. I don't know, or his millionaire daddy. Um, and so basically, um, what was it? So like the language that he uses, it exists in as the cause and the effect of of the Constitution, right? The Constitution causes the American identity to exist, and the American identity is the effect, um um or the Constitution is also its effect, right? It's the because like it causes the American identity to exist, and the American identity is itself the effect of the Constitution. And then we create a language to kind of illustrate the link between the two. And again, right? Because like economists like struggle with this all the time, and as going by your videos and the things that you said on stream and whatnot, right? That economists constantly are trying to explain causes and effects of different things, like market value, stock exchange, unemployment, and so on and so forth, right? Obviously, I'm simplifying because I am not an economist. I'm just going by vaguely economic things that I'm very fairly aware of.
Hmm.
But what you do is right, you're trying to explain the causes and the effects, right? And like when you do like any study, right, an economic study, how often do you like just like take certain words for granted or certain concepts for granted, right? Because like if you're trying to submit to an academic journal, there's always going to be a word limit, right? No more than I don't know 9,000 words. I'm just throwing a number out there, right? So because there's like a page or word limit, you have to work with what you have, and so you're gonna have to introduce certain concepts that you're just going to assume that your audience already knows what that means, right? And so that's where like what Lacanian psychoanalysts do is that what we do is we're trying to what Zizek calls it identifying the symptom and penetrating the fantasy, because what it is it's trying to get at the contradictions within the subject's identity and symbolic order, and understand their fantasy. What fantasy are they using to explain away the contradictions? And that's what I do with my rhetorical work. I use that type of Lacanian psychoanalysis to kind of explain and understand persuasive messaging within texts.
Okay, okay. So yeah, I mean, so like if your average economics paper will use like all sorts of concepts which are pretty abstract and like accepted by economists, right? So, for example, utility is a good example, right? Economists talk about people like maximizing utility, which means like basically preference satisfaction. But
Yeah,
utility is a kind of meaningless concept, like the idea that people kind of have some some utility that they actually gain is a meaningless concept, but it is still used at least to an extent
yeah,
in economics, despite being a fiction. And you know that most economists, especially mainstream ones, but even like heterodox ones, are going to know what you're talking about, right?
yeah,
But that's how you build. I mean, that's how you build like a kind of discipline, right? In a sense, and you have, and it works for science, by which I mean real science. But
yeah,
you have concepts and theories and ideas that everybody basically accepts,
yeah,
and then you
and
then you build on those concepts and use them, in the
yeah,
knowledge that everyone else will understand them.
Yeah, and that's the unconscious, right? Those concepts would be like the sublime object, but then you create a language in the middle to explain that gap, right? So like utility would be like a sublime object, and then you use language to kind of explain the causes and effects of that utility, right? What does utility cause, and what type of effects does it bring about? Okay, then we go back to the language, right? So, and I'm sure you that's obviously going to depend on the context. What are you applying it to? What theory? So like obviously it's going to be applied to like various different things, right?
Mm.
So for especially for you as an economist, right? But there's always a language, and that's what some of the things that really frustrates me with a lot of like hard science type people is that they often presuppose their own concepts to be a priori true, and then
Mm.
they never critically think about the language that they use. They just like they take what their formulas for granted, because to them it exists. It's like, yeah, okay, sure, this phenomenon might be something that exists, but the language that you use to talk about it is very different, right? So like folding ideas, I think his best video is the one
Mm.
about flat earth and QAnon, and he has a very short section where he talks about how like science communication, and we always talk about compasses as having a all compasses point north, but what folding ideas says is that that's only half true. What compasses do is they point at polarity. They're pointing at the magnetic field that exists at the north and the south, but that's not the language that we use to describe it. We say that it's pointing north because it's a way of privileging the global north and overlooking the global south, right? So, sure, like these things exist, but how do we talk about them? How do we use language to explain it, right? How do we kind of piece together the cause and the effect of this phenomena?
Right. Okay. 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 So, yeah. I mean, in in terms of like how can we use these insights, because this is one of the things. So when you so to everybody, like you contacted me on Patreon and
Mm-hmm.
said I'd like to chat about like rhetoric and economics, and I think one of the key things which we actually haven't really got onto yet is
Yeah,
like how can we use these insights to better improve rhetoric, or in terms of like economic policy, in terms of pushing, I guess leftist type economic policy, and then just improving our rhetoric in general.
I think so Dana Cloud, she's a rhetorician in my field. She has a really good book called Reality Bites. And she one of the things so basically what she argues is that the left has a problem. The problem with the left is they're too facts oriented. Like we
Problem.
are in what she calls the realm of reality, where we are all about this is factual, this is factual, this is factual, etc., etc. But what does the right do? Oh, like basically, like as Ben Shapiro says, facts don't care about your feelings, but all the right does is talk about its feelings. I think you've mentioned this before in a couple of your videos about how the right only seems to care about about their feelings, right? They appeal to the raw emotions of their conservative audience. And what I think the left needs to, because like I guess before we even go on, how often have you talked to a I mean, it might be very different in England because I'm speaking as an American,
Mm.
but like if like whenever I try to talk to conservatives about progressive policy, right? I don't. It's like they're. It's actually quite common for an American conservative to acknowledge that left-leaning people have better economic policy. It's actually not that hard to get them to agree to it. But what you'll notice is that they'll shift between I'm facts over feelings. Okay, you actually have the better facts than me, but let's talk about morality and philosophy, right? So that actually happened in the Charlie Kirk debate with Kyle Kalinske, because Kyle Kalinske pointed out, like, not only was Charlie Kirk factually incorrect in almost every single one of the things that he was saying, but he was also like it was just completely incorrect, completely bonkers on all of his points. And Charlie Kirk eventually conceded to all of that, but then he shifted the focus to philosophy and morality, right? So even if you justify the facts to a conservative audience, they'll just shift the conversation to a morality thing. And it's really not about morality, it's about identity. And I think what progressive economists need to do is they need to have better narratives, right? Because one of the ways that Ronald Reagan was able to dispel the New Deal, or at least the last remnants of the New Deal, was to point like in a way he kind of correctly pointed this out by with the New Deal and the implementation of economic experts and bureaucrats and whatnot. America was at its economically its strongest point ever, right? Now, obviously, there were flaws to that regarding racism and
Hmm.
housing discrimination against black people and so on. But in terms of the broad whole, economically speaking, America was like really, really, really prosperous. The white middle class in particular gained more wealth in that time, I think, than any point in American history or something like that.
Hmm.
I could be misremembering the data, but I'm pretty sure they got like a fuckload of value with the New Deal. But yet, those white suburban Americans overwhelmingly voted against the New Deal. Why was that? Because conservatives like Ronald Reagan painted a narrative like, okay, sure, the economy is really good, but like, what's it about the American soul, man? Um, and so he would like talk about how bureaucrats are like taking away people's freedoms because what they're doing is they're deciding how your life is being determined and your freedoms are being taken away. So people actively voted against their own economic prosperity because the right gave them a better narrative. And I think that's what the left in general needs to do, but I think that could be useful for leftist economists or progressive economists that rather than just throwing out numbers and statistics and theories at people at conservatives, what you do is you kind of create a narrative. You construct a narrative that appeals to that American identity. Or I say America, I'm speaking as an American, but like
Yeah.
whatever identity works for them.
Right. Okay. Okay. So I suppose. So before we get on to how exactly you do that, I guess one thing that this makes me slightly concerned about is that, like, you're right that in essence the right have often seemed to abandon facts, and just been, like Charlie Kirk, just completely the things they say just can be completely unsupported.
Yeah,
Um, not all the time. I hesitate to say there are some right wingers that I don't think do that, and quite a few people to the right of me that I don't think really do that. But there does seem to be this wing of just like complete disregard for the facts, and I guess just really caring about like what you're calling the sublime object, right?
yeah.
Um, and we don't want to be like that, do we? Right?
Well, and the thing is, we don't. But the way it's more of like because like the left, especially within like the Gamergate era. I don't know if you were around during Gamergate, but
Yeah, I was.
oh, okay. So you were in the trenches just like me. Um, so basically, like, what was Gamergate about, right? Like the Gamergate was literally an entire movement predicated on a lie. The idea that Zoe Quinn slept with some game journalist to get good reviews on their game from some Kotaku reviewer or whatever, right? Well, there are obvious problems with this narrative. One, Kotaku had never reviewed Zoe Quinn's game, and also Kotaku, I think, only mentioned Zoe Quinn or their Zoe Quinn's game, I think, like 3 times maybe in passing, but like never anything like substantive, right? The entire Gamergate narrative that led to the movement was predicated on a lie, but people believed in it, and people didn't care if it was true. And so, while not every right winger necessarily acts like this, and I don't think every right winger acts like this, I think right wing mediascape acts like this. The right
Mm.
wing media, like Fox News, OAN, The Sun, I'm trying to think of any British conservative
Daily
outlets.
Mail.
Daily Mail. There we go. I completely forgot about the fucking Daily Mail. Um, but or JFK. Or, I'm sorry, not JFK. JK Rowling's fucking Twitter account. Um, but so yeah, like so the right. I would argue that the right wing media scape um is very prone to this, even if not every single individual conservative does this. Because it's what drives, views. It's what gets people to watch the channel is that outrage content, right? And so I don't think that what was it that I don't think I don't think that the left needs to like be like super dogmatic and like no longer care about facts. But I think that the left needs to be more open about, narrativizing their findings, right? Because like imagine if you went up to like, some average Joe Schmo here in the, working class person over here in America and tried to explain to them like post-Keynesian economics. Like some of them might listen to you, but I know for a fact I lived in West Virginia for a couple of years. A lot of
Mm,
them would call you like a commie soy boy. Um,
mm, mm.
they probably say other things too that I probably can't say on YouTube.
They'd be
And
correct.
they would be correct. They would be correct. They would be correct.
Yeah.
Um,
But
uh,
it's a oh Jesus Christ, I've forgotten the word for it. A divine object? What is it?
Sublime object.
Sublime object, sorry. It
Yeah.
is like soy boy though, right? Again, like it's like what it represents versus the act of actually eating soy, which is obviously just absolutely fine.
Yeah.
And it's in just most things you eat. But then like what it represents. So yeah, I think I'm finally starting to get it.
Yeah, and that's what I think like a lot of progressive scholars need to do is not just in economics, just in general, right? How do we make this narrative? How do we make these progressive policies seem appealing to people who might be more susceptible to like narrativization, right? Um, and so how do we appeal to a group, an audience that is prone to this type of rhetoric, right? Because unfortunately facts is not going to get them. Like I think Ben Shapiro is ironically the best example because like when you watch Ben Shapiro, have you ever, I don't know how much Ben Shapiro you've watched, but like if you've
Enough.
watched enough, right? So how often does his logic rely on like intuition?
Mm.
Like all the time, right? His like whenever
So
he talks about like facts and logic, he's his logic is never really logic, it's more intuition.
oh, he's larping, right? He's like literally,
Yeah.
it's the whole thing
It,
is a
it,
larp
it,
or a
yeah.
sublime object about using facts versus feelings. I mean, I watched. So I've got a video coming out on gender, and I watched it. It's about Jordan Peterson mostly, but I watched a bit of Ben
Nice.
Shapiro, and there's a bit where oh. I won't try and do his voice because I don't think I can go that high. But like, he was like, he was like, oh, it was about gender roles, and he was like, I don't think anybody's saying to little girls, you can't play with that toy, you've got to go and be, a nurse or whatever. And that was it. And that was his argument. And it's like, obviously
Works.
that does happen and has happened for a very long time. People
And the
encouraging little boys and girls to fulfill certain gender roles. That is a thing that's well established. And
Yeah.
like, and he's just sitting there going like, "Well, I don't think that's happening." Sorry, I couldn't help but to his voice, but like, you know what I mean? He
Oh
just
yeah.
says, "Oh, I
Yeah.
don't think that's happening," and it's like, and then all the conservative audience are like clapping, and I'm like, he hasn't said, he's just said what he thinks is might be the case. That's not
Yeah.
facts. And the video was actually titled something stupid like epic, Shapiro destroys gender pay gap with epic facts or something,
Yeah.
and you're just like,
Because
this is nonsense.
yeah, exactly. Because the whole point is that it's the aesthetics of logic rather than actual logic, right? It's it's the way it's appealing. I would argue in this case, logic is a kind of like a sublime object because what it does is it fills in the gap, or it fills in the inconsistencies of people's like inadequacies, right? Because it's a way for you to like kind of project your insecurities onto Ben Shapiro. Because haven't you noticed that most of Ben Shapiro's audience is largely like annoying 16-year-old libertarian dudes who like probably got bullied a
No.
lot in high school. Like, let's be real. Most of the people watching Ben Shapiro aren't like middle-aged people, like Bush or Bush is actually pretty old, but like you know what I mean. Like
Hmm.
like middle-aged conservatives aren't watching Ben Shapiro. It's like fucking 16-year-old Zoomer, fucking what was it? Like libertarian dude bros who got bullied in high school and are looking for an excuse to get back at like the black guys who bullied them. Like, let's be real,
Yeah. You know,
right?
it's really interesting because I have very briefly had arguments with some of these people, and I said because as soon as I realised their age and their views, I just kind of duck out of it. But
Yeah, like, oh, you're only
yeah,
16. Oh, you
yeah,
okay? I'll
yeah,
let you alone.
yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. Yeah, but like one of the interesting, one of the things about it is I find if you kind of challenge them factually, they'll just sort of start repeating like facts don't care about your feelings.
Yeah,
They just
because
they just keep saying it, and you're like, but
it's
you're
like,
not. I've just shown you a fact, but now you're just repeating your little mantra over and
and,
over again. And it's,
and
it's
the
I mean, I kind of respect how well Ben Shapiro and the vast Hollywood apparatus that surrounds him have managed to embed that as something that can like win arguments. I mean, I kind of it's
yeah,
a masterclass in sublime objects, but
yeah.
yeah,
It's like
it's terrible.
it's kind of like you know what kind of reminds me of? It kind of reminds me of like when we were like kids and there was like our favorite cartoon or video game that had like our favorite quips and quotes and we just quoted it all the time, not realizing it made absolutely no fucking sense. But and then like when someone like pointed out that like that doesn't really make any sense and you're like, yeah, it does, and you just repeat it and you just repeat it.
Yeah.
That's that's what it always
Like an
reminds me of.
argument with your sibling or something. Like,
Yeah, that you
no, I
have in the
didn't. No, I
shower.
didn't. Yes, you did. No, I didn't. Yes, you did. That kind of thing. It's no more
Yeah.
sophisticated than that, but it gives the appearance of being so, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because it's like they the whole point isn't to actually provide arguments. The whole point is to fill in some type of gap, or to fill in some type of inadequacy, or some missing thing, some contradiction, right? Or as what Lacanian would say, a symptom, right? A contradiction within your universal character, right? And so what Ben Shapiro does, and Ben Shapiro does this more than others, but like definitely of all right wing media, basically to a certain extent, does this, is that they create narratives that people are not supposed to think about. It's supposed to be very intuitive. It's supposed to basically make you sit there going like, oh yeah, that's absolutely correct because it's intuitively correct rather than like factually correct, right? And so that's why I agree with Dana Cloud that yeah, the left is generally on the side of facts, right? We
Mm.
generally have like things that are factually correct, that are backed up by data, and we can generally push our positions a lot more, logically, right? Well, what the right does then is goes, okay, we're going to adopt the aesthetics of logic, but in
Mm.
reality, what we're going to do is we're going to create like thought terminating cliches, and just repeat a bunch of dogma because and what we get to call you is we get to call you out of touch soy boy, fucking bureaucrats or whatever word they come up with, right? Because this is actually something that Richard Hofstadter, who was the historian who coined the term paranoid style, um, he wrote a book back in 1964, called Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. It actually won the nonfiction Pulitzer, back in 1964. It's a really good book, where he basically
Yeah.
draws out the history of anti-intellectualism in America. And he does a really good job explaining about how like the Protestant movement was really big on like being like anti-intellectual. And regardless of whether or not you're talking about religion, business, capitalists, or politics or whatever, there's a consistent theme that you find between intellectuals and anti-intellectuals. Anti-intellectuals will act as if the intellectual is kind of like divorced from the needs of the working class
Oh,
people,
right.
right? Like that's what like you're a PhD economist, you will absolutely be called that if you were to go to like a conservative convention in America.
Yeah.
Uh, right? They'll just say you're an out of touch economist who doesn't know anything about the
Partly
real
true.
needs of America.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So that's why I think that's what the left needs to do, and not just again, not just in economics, and like, and not even just in academia in general. We need to have better narratives. Narratives are what move people. Narrative, like oh, what was it? Kenneth Burke. I have the book here somewhere, but Kenneth Burke has this really good line, um, where he basically says, people are so obsessed with being people are so obsessed with being some part of unity or some type of group or identity that they'll meet you halfway, even if what you say is completely false.
Mm.
We're so obsessed with finding any type of identity, regardless of the factual basis of that identity,
Mm.
so long as it gives us like something. I think Jordan Peterson is actually probably even better at this than Ben Shapiro, because what Jordan Peterson does is he gives disaffected, lonely men
Mm.
like an ability to kind of find some type of unity or identity for themselves,
Yeah.
and they're so desperate for that type of identity because they feel that their masculinity has been robbed of them, that they're willing to jump at the beck and call of Jordan Peterson, um to kind of what was it? They're willing to jump at Jordan Peterson's throat or lap or whatever you want to call it, right? They're willing to basically be a part of his cult
Mm.
and not even think about his actual arguments because he's giving them an identity.
Yeah. No, absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, it's really, it's really interesting actually how strongly some people identify with Jordan Peterson, right? And not just yeah, and with a lot of individuals as well. I mean, some of them, like you said, Peterson's probably the master of kind of being the Pied Piper of his audience, but like the fact that they just sort of really will defend him to the death, it
Yeah,
seems. If you say anything about him, I mean, I'm looking forward to this. I'm going to see this in my video, right? I know I don't really criticize that many right wingers on my channel. My channel's been a bit different to that, but
yeah,
it's like it's the first time I'm going to do it, and I expect the vehemence of the response to be
yeah.
possibly unlike anything I've encountered before.
I don't know.
So
I
yeah.
feel like whenever you do your video on Thomas Sowell, I
Oh
feel
yeah.
like you'll probably get a decent response. I feel like he's like I feel like he has like a similar audience, like a bunch of like
Yeah.
conservative dweebs who've never actually read Thomas Sowell, but he says the things that they want to hear.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it does. Yeah, that's another one that'll kind of open up my right flank a bit because actually I've been criticizing the left more.
Yeah,
Um, but it's like, I mean, it's interesting, right? What you're saying about identity, because I do find that it depends. I think it's universal in the sense that um, uh, when you, sorry, I'm fighting a boss.
no, you're good. No, you're good.
When somebody knows that you're broadly coming from the same value structure, or maybe that you're at least a fan of Jordan Peterson, let's say, then they're much more receptive to what you have to say, right?
Yeah,
Automatically. And so when people kind of knew, I mean, I get accused of being a liberal quite frequently, but like when people kind of knew that I'm a leftist, then they're willing to accept my criticisms of left wingers more than if
yeah,
it were equivalently coming from a right winger, right? And I mean it's just tribalism, right?
yeah.
But I
It's
guess
identification.
you probably have some like quite deeper insights into it than I do.
Well, because one of the things, like one of Kenneth Burke's like most famous contributions to rhetoric is identification. That like I forgot which I think it was Athenian. Yeah, it's easier to talk about the greatness of Athenians if you're an Athenian talking to another Athenian, right? If you're an American talking about the greatness of America, and how great America is, right? It's easier to do that with other Americans because it's just identification. If you identify with each other, it becomes much easier to advocate for your positions, right? And so that identification process is really, really, really key. And that's where I think you'll grab onto people like I've moved people over to the left who are like big Ben Shapiro fans or Jordan Peterson fans by pointing out that what they're advocating for is explicitly anti-American. Now,
Right.
Like now, whether or not that's necessarily fully, completely true is not really the point. The point is to get them to at the very least recognize that what they're doing, because like the whole point of America, and yes, there is is racism part of America? Absolutely. In fact, I would argue racism is probably the thing that makes America America, right? But like there are definitely reactionary aspects of America, right? However, we still rely on some type of like identity to make changes to that American identity, right? Like we forget the Bill of Rights was added after the Constitution was created. The Constitution in its initial state did not guarantee free speech. It didn't guarantee free speech in any way, shape, or form. It did not guarantee a right to bear arms. It did not guarantee that police that like do things like due process, right?
Yeah.
These are things that we take for granted in the Bill of Rights, but they weren't in the Constitution. We used the Constitution as a basis to create policy, as to create policy to kind of like expand upon the American identity, that sublime object, right? And so, like what Vosh has a really good line where he talks about I forgot which video he did this on. He talked about how conservatives will often talk about America as if it's weak, right? What do before conservatives concede that leftists or liberals in general have like better economic policies, right? If they'll concede before they concede to that, what do they always say? They'll say things like that America can't afford things like universal health care. We can't afford things like, making college affordable for everyone. Like America can't afford that. We can't afford that. We can't afford that. And what Vosh said is that I feel like leftists are actually more patriotic than conservatives, because what leftists would say is, no, we are not only can we afford it, we can afford it 5 times over. We're America. We're the United States of motherfucking America. We're the wealthiest and most powerful country in the world. If you say that we can't afford it, then you're not American, right? Like that is how you get people, right?
Okay, so that was quite compelling. Your audio massively improved when you when you said that. I thought it was a message on Elden Ring. I was like, what the fuck's going on? It really changed.
I'm doing that. I was doing that like tactic where like streamers like get really close to their mic to add effect.
I actually thought it might be I thought someone different had like got onto the stream or something. I don't know what I thought. But yeah, no, it was good. I mean, it's funny you mentioned Vosh. Oh God, why are we talking about Vosh? No disrespect, Vosh. But I mean, he's a good rhetorician, right?
Yeah.
Love him or hate him. Like he's really good at rhetoric. More so than probably most modern left political activists, thinkers, whatever. I find him extremely effective.
And that's why, and a lot of the things that I learned about like leftism, or at least my advocacy for leftism, like came from like looking at like how Vosh kind of identifies and analyzes particular arguments. Because like for me, like don't get me wrong, I watch other leftist streamers or content creators. I watch Dylan Burns or I'm trying to, who else do I watch? I know I'm blank. Of course, I'm blanking now because my brain does that whenever I need what was it? Every time I need to name a name in a conversation, I always fucking forget that. But I know I watch other leftist content creators, but like a lot of leftist content creators or just progressive, it's always like giving their opinion about what conservatives said that day or that time, that segment, right? How it's crazy, it's racist, that blah blah, or they debunk a claim, right? It's pretty simple. But what Vosh does is that he kind of like he doesn't just do that. He explains what like not just why it's wrong, but the logic by which conservatives kind of think about when they make these arguments, right? So like I didn't know about 1350 until I started watching Vosh, right? And so 1350 became like something that I think about daily, not because I believe in it, but because this is what conservatives think, and they think like this because of this way.
Mm.
And I think that's what the left needs to start doing is they need to start examining arguments rather than just treating arguments like, oh God, how do we? Because the the left has a lot of problems, but one of the
Mm.
main problems that the left has is that when it comes to making arguments, they kind of obsess with abstract arguments so much so that they stop like it makes them incapable of engaging with new arguments on the right. Because like for them, for a lot of lefties, the right makes this argument, and it's like it's it's this abstract thing, which technically is kind of true, but if you're trying to get people on your side, it's just not going to work. Um,
Could you give us an
and so
example, maybe?
so like a good example, oh, should I even mention his name? I'm trying to think. 'Cause there's one left there. I don't even call him a lefty, but there oh god, I'm gonna say it. I don't care.
Yeah.
Bada Panada. Bada Panada. So he's a piece of shit. He has a history of harassing a lot of Jewish content creators because he's a bit of an anti-Semite.
Mm.
But like what he does is he relies on the aesthetics of like leftist, like some of the things if you think abstractly are kind of true, but you're never going to get people on the right to listen with the things that he says. So like for instance, um he'll often talk about like Israel, right? That Israel he'll like I can't even repeat half the things he says on YouTube, so I'm not
Right.
even gonna
Okay.
bother.
Yeah.
But like
I know. I think we all know the type of thing that we're talking about.
yeah, right. So like but what he does is he uses that very violent anti-Semitic language,
Mm.
but through the language of leftist decolonization or post-colonial theory, right? He uses the aesthetics of post-colonial theory to justify like basically a genocide against Jewish people, right?
Mm.
And so what I think is that a lot of lefties don't, not to that extreme, but will rely on very abstract notions of things like post-colonial theory, or what else, like Marxist theory or anarchist theory or whatever. They rely on these very abstract theories to explain right-wing talking points generally, but
Mm.
you're not going to get like moderates or whatever onto your side by like talking like that. You're just not, because to them that just sounds like partisan talk, right? Because the way a lot of people think is, and I kind of learned like when you talk to like normies for a lot. I hate that word, but I bet that's the internet slope.
Yeah, yeah, no, I hate it
I,
too, but it also
I
does serve a function, unfortunately.
yeah, it does sort of. I hate it because not only does it feel like weirdly classist, it also is
Mm.
like so fucking cringy. I don't know.
It's really embarrassing. It's really
It's like
embarrassing.
if I ever said that word in front of my mom, I would actually kill myself. No, fuck
Yeah.
that. Um, but like the way that a lot of normies, people talk about politics is that they always they will often talk about politics as, everyone just has their own position. Everyone's kind of like in the
Mm.
middle, and we just gotta have to come together and get along.
Mm.
And what that it's kind of like they don't realize they're doing it, right? But what they're doing is they're almost trying to depoliticize politics, because to them everyone has a side, right? And you're just supposed to pick a side. It's like, imagine, like, when people come up to you, like, like people who just learned about politics yesterday come to you screaming about, are you a collectivist or an individualist, right? Like, what the fuck does that even mean, right?
Mm.
Like, what do you mean? Like, because everyone knows like the general arguments for individualism and collectivism, right? But like everyone just has their own positions, and we just have to respect that, right? And what I think the left needs to do is they need to start dissecting arguments and understanding where arguments are coming from, because it makes people who don't really engage in politics that much less susceptible to right-wing propaganda, because that's something that I've started to notice, is that a lot of conservatives or a lot of far right types that you see online, like whether it be like the alt-right or the QAnon types, if you ask them, when did you start getting into politics, a lot of them will tell you that they started getting into politics around 2016 when Trump announced it, or 2015, 2016 when Trump announced his candidacy. That's when they started getting into politics. It's when they read the Podesta emails back in 2016, in October of 2016, or they started reading the 4chan or 8chan Q drops or whatever. Um, and so when so that's how a lot of people get into the right, right? Is that, and the right is very good at this, because the right is very good at making their reactionary politics seem as if they are pre-political. That's what Reagan did. Reagan made his reactionary politics seem as if it was not even political. This is just an American
Mm.
thing. This is a good versus evil thing. This has nothing to do with like the right and the left. This has everything to do with what it means to be an American, right? And you're either going up with me or down with them. Um and so when so people like that and Panada and other like lefties like that use these vague general abstract language of like post-colonial theory to say things that like kill all Jews or whatever, you're not going to get people to listen to you. You're not going to get people to listen to you because not only do you look crazy, but you look partisan. And that's what I think a lot of moderates or normies don't understand. A lot of moderates and normies don't like, is they don't like the feeling as if they're being partisan, if that makes sense.
Mm. Mm.
They don't like the idea of being a partisan hack is not uh is not what was it? Yeah, being a partisan hack is something a lot of like non-political people don't like.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like post politics almost, isn't it? In some ways, it's like I don't know what it is. Was it kind of the success of Bill Clinton and Tony Blair? Um, and okay, sorry, there was a problem with my chat before that. It literally all of my tech is going wrong today. On the day that I
No,
decided to do the most complicated thing, which is play
no,
computer games while talking to somebody, but it's all just gone wrong. But it's back now. But yeah, like that kind of like post politics, and I think a lot of people tend to identify with the center. Now, of course, all of them probably have very different views, right? So that they don't necessarily, they don't mean the same thing by the center, but it's a good example of something that I think people just find, I don't know, comforting, that I don't know whether they think they're like beyond politics, or they're compromising, they're being reasonable by being in the center. But you see it a lot, right?
yeah. I think the reason is because it's like muddying the waters, right? It's because people are more partisan than they realize, but
Mm.
they don't like to acknowledge it because they it make because they're worried that it would alienate them from, like, say, friends or family or whatever, right?
Mm.
So one of Slavoj Žižek's famous claims is that the way ideology works, the moment you think you've escaped ideology,
Mm.
that is when ideology is at its strongest, because you're presupposing yourself as being pre or post ideological, like you're beyond ideology. We're just talking the way things really are. Well, the way things really are is often associated and constructed through or by ideology, right? And so when you're acting as if um when you're acting as if you're beyond ideology, you're actually more ideological than you were before you said that.
Yeah.
Um and so um basically what I think what interests me is like getting people who aren't politically active and keeping them from falling into the far right is to appeal to them while not looking partisan. Is it that's pretty much like what I would say. Like that's because that's what the right does. The right is really good at getting people who aren't necessarily that political, but getting them deeply into the far right without looking as if they're partisan.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, it's funny because if you look at the alt right and the rise of all of that, they tend to say things like, they actually still tend to identify as centre or moderate or liberal, right? They say they're liberal, right? That's the thing you often hear.
Yeah,
Um, what they're saying. I mean, in the UK context, that means one thing, which
yeah,
is that you're kind of centre. In the US context, that actually means that you're left wing. But they'll say,
yeah,
I'm actually a leftist. It's just that the left has moved so far left that now my views are regarded as extreme right when actually, I haven't shifted them. I'm pretty sure Elon Musk shared a meme to that effect not too long
yeah,
ago.
yeah. It's like, and again, I'm speaking as an American. I can't speak at what happens over
Mm.
in Britbonger land. But but what I can say is that a lot of Americans are very afraid of being partisan. I think that's one of the reasons why the Republican Party has been so effective and the Democrats have been so ineffective, right?
Mm.
Because what sorry, my I'm having a bunch of mucus today for some reason, but
Lovely.
must be my allergies. Must be my
Right.
allergies today. But so I think the right has been able to galvanize itself super effectively by oh, okay, perfect example. Ron DeSantis. I'm from Florida, so Ron DeSantis is my fucking governor, and I want to die every time I think about him.
Mm.
Are you familiar with Ron DeSantis and his
No, no,
go?
no.
So Ron DeSantis is the governor of Florida, and he is basically he's kind of it's pretty obvious that he's going to be basically take the mantle as the next Trump. Um, like every poll has shown that he is expected to be the next Trump. Like it's Trump for 2024, Ron DeSantis for 2024, and
Mm.
every other Republican doesn't even make it past 1%.
Oh wow.
Um, yeah, like it's like Trump like gets like I think 40%. DeSantis on average gets like 24 or 25% of people who want him to run for 2024. And then you have like um uh everyone else like Ted Cruz or whatever, they don't even get 1%. Um and so Ron DeSantis, if you should watch his speeches to kind of get the effect of what I'm about to describe.
Right.
So basically, Ron DeSantis is basically like how do you describe it? It's like if you look at his speeches now, he's even started to copy Donald Trump's hand gestures
Oh
almost to a
God.
T on purpose, and he does that on purpose.
Mm.
And he a lot of the bills he passes isn't really to make Florida's lives better. He passes legislation like he passes joke legislation. He was the guy who posted the Stop Woke Act, which basically said that like schools couldn't teach critical race theory. But it actually went
Right.
beyond just grade school, because grade school you don't learn critical race theory. That's not what that is, right? But it didn't just talk about grade school. Uh, it actually made it illegal, not illegal, but it actually put massive restrictions on even like university academics to talk about critical race theory in the classroom. Even in universities, they had like restrictions. That's how intense that bill was.
Mm.
Um, and if I remember correctly, and I have to double check on this, but I'm pretty sure he also passed a bill where he basically if you're a university professor, you have to register your political allegiance, and if a university doesn't have enough like parity between conservatives and liberals,
Mm.
the university can get punished. I think like they either get fined or something like that. I can't remember. Like he's passed some wild fucking bills. Um, and he does that because he's trying to appeal to a particular audience. But if you listen to the language of Ron DeSantis, what you'll notice is that they don't sound partisan. They don't sound very they almost sound like logical or common sense. So like he recently passed a bill So you know, like how doctors won't let you see your dying like family member if they have a contagious disease because for like obvious reasons, right? Like if your parent
Yeah.
was like dying of like COVID, they won't let you into the room because they don't want you get again like as you said, you have two brain cells that like can like hit together, right?
Hmm.
Um, he passed a bill like fairly recently that made it illegal for hospitals to prevent patients from seeing their family members if they're dying from a disease, even if it's infectious, because it's their choice,
Hmm.
right? So like the language, like the policy is batshit fucking crazy, but he's relying on the emotions of his audience, but and he doesn't look partisan. He actually looks neutral because why wouldn't you want to see your dying mother if she's dying from a deadly disease? Why
Hmm.
shouldn't you have the choice? Why shouldn't these bureaucratic doctors who don't know what's good for us make all these decisions for what's good for us, right? So that's what he does. He's able to galvanize the right and to get the right or moderates or independents. He's really good at getting them to jump on board far right talking points while making them feel as if they're not partisan. And that's what the right's very good at. The right is very good at not talking as if they're partisan or making people feel as if they're not partisan.
Yeah. So, like, I mean, it always amazes me the whole free speech debate because I followed it for a while and then I kind of bowed out of it because it just seemed very apparent to me that there was a pretty blazing contradiction, which was essentially that the people who were saying they were defending free speech were actually the ones who wanted to like you said, put university professors on lists
Yeah.
and actually shut down free speech properly, right?
And Ron DeSantis claims to be a libertarian too.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And then you just end up with a situation where they're almost shutting down free speech, like in the name of free speech, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So free
Eh, eh,
speech
eh,
is the what's it called again? Tell me. The bone.
the sublime object.
Sublime. I
Yes.
always want to say divine. Maybe it's because I'm playing Elden
I
Ring,
guess,
but
I
yeah,
guess that works to a certain extent. Yeah, yeah, I guess that works to a certain extent.
yeah. So yeah, that's the sublime object, like free speech, but it doesn't actually. It's pretty detached from what free speech actually means when you're when you're banning the teaching of certain ideas in schools, on in the name of free speech.
Yeah, and like one of the ways that Ron DeSantis defended his Stop Woke Act is that he argued that critical race theory makes Americans feel bad,
Mm,
and we don't want people to feel bad about themselves. We This is divisive.
mm,
This is divisive. This is making Americans feel like they're inherently racist when they're not. We're a unified America. We're not racist. We're beyond race or whatever, right? And so that language, right? It's a way of getting people to support explicitly anti-free speech policy
mm.
while thinking that it's free speech, right? Because
Yeah.
to them, what matters is like maintaining some type of group identity. Ironically, these people will claim to be individualists, but they're the most fucking collective human beings on the planet.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's what that I think like something that like economists can need to like start engaging in. I think uh and I know you said it doesn't matter if you mispronounce his name because everyone mispronounces it. So
Mm.
I'm gonna say Kenzian. There we go. I'm just gonna
Oh
say
yeah.
Kenzian. But like I think you said in your conversation with Joe Michelle that that or I think Joe said this that Kynes kind of structured his writing depending on the political situation that he was in at the time.
Mm.
And so he was like almost, or it might have been you that he was inconsistent, but deliberately inconsistent because it depended on the audience he was writing to.
Mm.
Um, And so I think that's something that like economists or progressive economists need to be willing to do. Like be willing to engage in inconsistent like language depending on the audience that you're talking to, right? Because if you're talking to a bunch of like, you know, MAGA Trumpers or whatever, the language that you're going to use with them is going to be very different from how you're talking to like me, right?
Yeah.
Because like how many words and phrases have I used up to this point that we take for granted that the right would never accept, right? A bunch of people, right? Like I've said racism a bunch of times, right? But to us, racism means very different things between us and the right. So that's where I think uh, ideology itself is something that's inherent. It's something that we're always going to do.
Mm.
There's nothing that we can do to stop that. And I think we need to acknowledge. I think we need to acknowledge that and use it to our advantage to get moderates who are more partisan than I think they're willing to acknowledge.
Yeah. Okay. So like yeah. How exactly do we do that? Right. Is I guess my question. Like, do you have any specifics? I mean, we talked about Vorsh,
Yeah.
but let's not give him the
Yeah.
satisfaction of being our good example.
Oh yeah,
But
yeah.
like any type of campaigns or anything that you think leftists, because leftists are pretty bad at rhetoric, right? Like you said, we're
Yeah.
just, I don't know what we're doing, like some combination of being kind of holier than thou,
Yeah.
ignoring people, talking in maybe too abstract terms, or
Yeah, ironically enough, we kind of look like conservatives if you think about it. Because from that's why how like Gamergate started, right? Because
yeah,
a lot of Gamergaters thought that their games were being taken from them because feminists and progressives were like censoring what was allowed in video games or whatever. And there are leftists who kind of give that impression. They kind of look like conservatives when you listen from like a neutral perspective. It's like, oh, you just want to like get rid of things you don't like.
yeah.
And so I think a good example would be like I don't know if there's a good example like that exists right now, but that I can think of. But like for instance, like so do me a favor, explain to me like the basics of like post-Keynesian economics.
Post-Keynesian economics is so I'm fighting Horalu. Do you play Elden?
Oh, you're fighting Godfrey. Oh yeah.
Godfrey. Yeah. So forgive me. But post-Keynesian economics. Okay, it's killed me. Yeah. So post-Keynesian economics is an approach which says that essentially the government should always take action to make sure that everybody has a job and a good job, and everybody's employed and the economy is running hot. So people's incomes are increasing and productivity is increasing, and generally, everyone's better off.
Okay, so so a conservative would say,
Mhm.
okay, maybe that'll give us economic prosperity or whatever, but like I don't want some government bureaucrat telling me what I need to do, right? I want my American freedom, right? America is based on individual. I don't want like what some government bureaucrat tell me or whatever, right? Here's what I as a leftist would say. No,
Yeah.
post-Keynesian economics would actually give you more freedom because the freedom to do something and the access of that freedom are two different things. I think Americans should not only have the freedom to do X, Y, or Z thing, I think they should have the access to do that sort of freedom. We like the ability to have economic prosperity allows you to give you the freedom to do whatever the hell you want without worrying about whether or not you're going to starve. I think America is strong enough and economically prosperous enough to support government policies like, say, a federal jobs guarantee, right, or something like that. I think America is stronger than you think it is. You think America is weak. I think America is strong. I think America has the ability to do all of these things because it is the strongest government and the strongest nation in the world. I think if America can do all the things that you claim that it does, I think it's more than capable of doing this. Or something like that. You see what I did, right? Like
Yeah.
I sounded almost like a fucking raw fucking American flag with an eagle flying behind my back with two like M16s
Yeah.
firing from both of my hands. But I'm saying leftist shit, right? So I'm saying leftist shit. So what does and not only do I sound like a national like some national hero or whatever, I make the conservative look like a soy boy cuck boy, right? Because he looks weak and I look strong, and I know that sounds so simple, but unfortunately that grabs people. That grabs people. So that's where that's where I think I think that's what I think a good start, right? Is to like kind of we have the facts, right? We have the facts. That's easy. But I think what we need to do is we need to start engaging more in like this type of not national sentiment, but like narrativization sentiment. Because also another really funny thing. What was it? Because in the debate between Kyle Kalinske and Charlie Kirk, Kyle Kalinske absolutely had the crowd in that entire debate. And Charlie Kirk stumbled because his neoconservatism kind of came out a bunch of times. But whereas and the thing is like in today's society being like anti-elitist is kind of the thing. People don't like the ultra wealthy. People don't like wealthy businessmen or whatever. Even in conservative circles, they just don't like them because they're like out of touch. Don't right, like that whole spiel, right? And so when Charlie Kirk was talking, he was spinning between being like a neocon who was like actively supporting the elites and being like this populist who hates the elites, right? And Kyle Kalinske was really good at pointing that out. Like, it seems like you're constantly flinging through being like this populist while also being like this phony or neocon, right? Like, it's almost like the neoconservatism is more important to you than your populism, because every time you talk about like, holding the wealthy to account, and I'm like, yeah, I agree. We should like tax them more, right? And then all of a sudden I do that, and then you all of a sudden back up to, well, they're entrepreneurs. They're doing great for our economy, right? So that's where I think you win against the right. Zizek even has a really good example about this. So he talks about like Nazi imagery, right? So Nazi imagery by themselves isn't really that offensive on their own, right? Like without any context, right? If you show someone who doesn't know what Nazism is, right, and you just show them the swastika, that means nothing to them, right?
Yeah.
They're what Zizek would call an empty signifier. And what he says the left needs to do is they need to almost decenter a lot of these signifiers, things like the swastika or like ultra masculine violence or whatever, and kind of fill them in with like just like full raw enjoyment, to like rob them of the right's ability to codify them. I think funny enough, a really good example would be like Warhammer, because Warhammer the aesthetics of Warhammer 40K plays a lot to the aesthetics of fascism, right? Like a lot of fascist aesthetics. If you look at Warhammer 40K, but the company is very progressive. They've actually made explicit attempts to like get a lot of the fasci types in their audience out of the community, and have explicitly like been going for like progressive audiences. And you'll notice that a lot of queer people love Warhammer 40K, and a lot of the more recent like iterations of the whether it be the games or the video games or the tabletop or whatever, they almost seem like they're using the almost fascist-esque. That's not a word, but I made it up. But that fascist-like aesthetic of Warhammer 40K, but they almost like decenter it, right? So like it uses like the aesthetics of fascism, but not for fascist ends. So like you get to do all these crazy cool fucking ripping orcs up like with these like big metal chainsaw guns or whatever, having a blast doing it, but you're not doing it for like fascist reason. You're doing it because it's just kind of cool. And when you do that, you rob the right of their ability to advocate for stuff because the left is just cool. Now, one of my took a critical cultural studies course last year, and my professor was from Austria, and he's a leftist too. And he basically said that one of his friends, oh, someone says chat. I think she just says it's about the what Reimstein does. Yes, that's exactly what I was referring to. Yes, Reimstein, the German band, does exactly this. They decenter a lot of the Nazi signifiers to where they don't what was it? They don't they rob the Nazis the ability to advocate for their positions by decentering their signifiers. And so that's what I think the left needs to do, is to kind of get at these differences and not be afraid to play with like these like really edgy things, because they could be really fun, right? They don't have like a lot of these really edgy, like, dark, big, almost fascist looking pieces of media necessarily has to be fascist. It can serve. And my Austrian professor. Sorry, I was getting sidetracked. But he basically said the reason why the Nazis took, like, he goes, one of the things that got people in Austria over to the Nazi party, they had motorcycles. That was it. They had motorcycles. Like that. Like the lefties were like doing these intense, like really complicated theory and like, constantly fighting each other. Dog, the Nazis had like cool motorcycles, bro. That was like that was like fucking cool. I like the motorcycle. Motorcycle go burr.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what I think the left needs to do. Motorcycle go burr. That honest to God, over 2 hours we've been talking, that's the lesson I want leftists to have. Motorcycle go burr.
I mean, one example that I thought of while you were talking about Nazis was actually Pepe the Frog, right? So that was an alt-right symbol for a while, but actually it kind of just got repurposed, and now people just use it in chat, and leftists use it a lot. And it's like, that doesn't mean anything to Nazis anymore, because it's just Pepe the Frog. Yeah,
it's Pepe the Frog. It's Pepe the Frog's actually kind of cute. So like, like people realize actually Pepe's kind of cute. Like I think he actually is really expressive. And so now the right and now what is the right have? Fucking the Groiper frog? Okay, they can have that. I don't want that. It's fucking ugly.
Which one's that? I haven't even heard of it. Which I guess shows you how successful it's been.
Well, the Groiper is Nick Fuentes' thing.
I do not know anything about that guy.
Nick Fuentes is probably he's a neo-Nazi. He's an American neo-Nazi.
Oh wait, I think I watched the Louis Theroux documentary with him actually.
Yeah, I actually know. I don't know him I know his siblings, and he is insane. And so what was it? Pepe the Frog. Yeah, Groiper is basically, think of Pepe the Frog, but like gross. I don't know how to describe it. Like, just look. You can like probably go on Google Images and just look up like Groiper. Someone said Groiper is fat, wrinkly one on the MAGA with a MAGA hat. Yeah, it's so ugly. Perfect example. Yeah, Pepe the Frog is absolutely the most perfect example ever, right? It's like, the right used Pepe the Frog as their symbol, and then what did the left do? Hey, Pepe the Frog's actually kind of cool. We're going to use him. And now everyone uses Pepe the Frog, and no one associates him with white supremacy.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. So you just completely nullify. I mean, somebody in chat, Aaron's saying about dog whistles, right?
Yeah.
And I think the interesting thing the thing about dog whistles is that they are repeated by people who don't necessarily know what they mean, right? And then it becomes difficult to know who's using it in the Nazi way and who just thinks it's a funny frog. I guess what you need to do is, just join the people who are using it in the neutral way, right? And just start making sure that's the use, so it drowns out the dog whistles.
Absolutely. Yes. Again, motorcycle go burr. That's the lesson.
Yeah.
That is the lesson. Motorcycle go burr. Pepe the Frog is pretty cool. Like, don't let the right it's like I'm going to bring up Vosh again, but you're in your conversation with
Mm.
Vosh, right? Like, what the main thing that you two talked about was like, don't let the right dominate economics, right? The
Yeah.
right has, because like most, like in America at least, most economists are Democrats. Most economists in America are liberal at the very least. Like,
Yeah.
but the right, if you look, if you look at polling, people think that most conservatives are like most people think that economists are like conservative, right? They think that like conservatives are better when it comes to the economy when they are objectively not, right? Like I got into this argument like with like my conservative family because like they're talking about gas prices and inflation or whatever. And like I had to point out to them like and I pointed to them like if you really want to blame anyone for the gas prices, you really ought to blame Donald Trump because he didn't take the pandemic seriously, right? Because now all these oil companies, and correct me if I'm wrong, like a lot of these oil companies now have to compensate for the lost revenue that they didn't make early on
Mm.
in the pandemic, right? So now they have to raise their prices to compensate, right? So
Mm.
if the pandemic didn't last as long as it did, if Trump took the pandemic seriously, then gas prices wouldn't be nearly as high as they were because now gas companies have to compensate for that loss of revenue, right? And but they don't care, right? And so and again, like, correct me, is that a fair assessment? Again, I'm not an economist, but that seems fairly like the most logical explanation, right?
It's entirely possible that they would have raised prices even if they had made money during the pandemic. But yeah, like,
True.
no, I see where you're coming from. But it's a
They
good
would have ra-
argument.
yeah, they would have raised prices anyway, and
Yeah.
that's why the Democrats proposed like the anti-price gouging bill, which every Republican in the House voted against. Um, so
Mm.
yeah, so it's like it's one of those things where the right is just it's amazing how they're so good at getting people to be partisan without feeling like they're partisan. That's the thing that's wild to me.
Yeah.
And that's what I think the left needs to figure out. They need to figure out how do they make people who are like in the center or apolitical, for lack of a better term, and making them political without thinking they're partisan
Mm.
at least initially, because once you become a leftist, then you realize that everyone is partisan.
Mm.
That's the difference. The left recognizes that everyone's partisan, the right doesn't.
Yeah.
That's the thing. So initially, right, like get them to be on the left thinking they're not partisan, and eventually that fades away because they realize, oh wait, everyone's literally partisan.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so that's where and but like again, like the right has been so good at like I like the Thomas Sowell, right? The Thomas Sowells of the world, I think have made give the impression that conservatives are actually like better at the economy because they rely on people's simplistic understanding of the economy. Because I mean, I'm sure you know about this. What's it called? The house budget fallacy? Is that what it's called? Where people
Uh, I don't. Yeah, some people might call it that. Yeah. Yeah.
you know like the idea that people think that the government spending is the same way as you budgeting your own personal budget, right? When they're not the same thing, right? I think yeah, I'm sure it probably has other names. That's the one that I think I think I've heard people say that, but you know what I mean, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so
Absolutely.
so like people like Thomas Sowell and other conservative like quote unquote economists, I guess he is an economist because he does have a PhD, I guess. Um,
Yeah.
like they have dominated the conversation about economics, and lefties just don't want to talk about that. And it's like lefties have such a good opportunity to like control the conversation of economics, but they just don't do it, and they need to start doing it because the more the right controls the conversation about economics, the more people normalize right-wing economic talking points while thinking they're being neutral.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I mean, this is kind of my life, right? Is about trying to reclaim economics for the left in a sense, and that means improving the economics on the left, but also pointing out that when the right say they've got economics on their side, they're talking crap. I mean, this is what I talked about in my Economics 101 video, where you just hear people like, oh, it's basic economics, it's Economics 101. And, I mean, there are so many things that are wrong with that, right? Number one, it isn't. Really.
Yeah.
Not if you have an honest. Oh God, that was a bad one. Not if you have an honest impression of what Economics 101 entails, which is a discussion of market failures and why you shouldn't believe the most simplistic model. But even if it were, Economics 101. Like, well, if you, I don't know, if you do Physics 101 and you try to use that to launch your rocket into space, you're not going to get very far because you're going to be missing a whole load of things which aren't covered in the introductory class. So why would you use basic economics to design policy? And I think, it does show how simplistic the thinking of these people is and how, and how ideological they are. Because, I mean, one of the points of that video was very much that the evidence doesn't support that kind of simplistic view. And so you end up with getting them to basically just come off as quite anti-intellectual and anti-empirical, which kind of contradicts like what they were trying to do in the first place, which is try and be like, oh, we've got economics behind us, we've got this well-respected quasi-scientific discipline. This supports what we believe in.
Yeah, exactly. And I actually think your Econ 101 video was probably you might not have realized it, but it actually was a critique of ideology. That's what you were doing.
Yeah.
You were critiquing ideology because Econ 101 because Econ 101 is like, because remember, because what did Zizek say, right? The moment we think we have escaped ideology, just when ideology is at its strongest, isn't that just Econ 101 in a nutshell, right?
Oh, yeah.
Econ 101 makes you think that you're not being partisan, that this is just the facts of the world, right? And it makes you overlook really complicated like data points, right? Again, I'm not an economist. Like I can't like debunk people like Thomas Sowell because I'm not an economist. I don't have the language to explain that, right? You do, right? But like when we look at how we talk about like economics or whatever, when people say, oh, that's just economics 101, right? Like what they're saying is like I'm not critically thinking about my own predisposition towards economic policy and assuming that they're correct.
No, absolutely. I mean, it is a video about ideology, and I think what's interesting about it is if you compare it to my other videos. I mean, I said the Jordan Peterson video will probably get a lot of responses, and when I eventually do a Thomas Sowell one, it probably will as well. But I mean, I've spoken about some fairly controversial things. I've made response videos, but the Econ 101 video was the one that angered certain people the most, because it was an attack on the basis of their ideology, which they represent as a supply and demand diagram. But what it actually means is, I think I'm super smart, and also I believe in the free market.
Yeah. At that point, it's not facts. It's almost not. It's basically no. It's not almost. It's identity. Like the free market. You don't support the free market because the free market's good. You support the free market because you identify with the free market. The free market and what it represents, or what it fails to represent as a sublime object, fills in the inconsistency of your identity, and so you use it as a way to construct an identity for yourself. That's what it does, right? It's not, and I think part of the reason why you probably got so much vitriolic response to it is not just because you were questioning their ideological predispositions, but what you were also doing is you were making them realize that they were more partisan than they thought they were.
Yeah.
Like you're more partisan than you realize. No, I can't be partisan. No, like a fucking soy chug. Like no, I can't be partisan. No, I can't. No, this is just the way it is. This is who I am.
Yeah.
No, like right, like, and so so that's where that's why I really liked your Econ 101 video, because it does a really good job pointing out ideology, and that is that's something that needs to be more. And honestly, I think every time I say economists, I always want to say economics. I don't know why. economists are in a unique position, I think, to use their understanding of econ to critique ideology. Because, and I think, and I, who was it? Was it who wrote? I actually have the book. Capital in the 21st Century. Who wrote
Oh,
that?
Piketty, Thomas Piketty.
Piketty. Yeah, I think you quoted him by saying that like economists need to get. I'm obviously paraphrasing him, but that economists need to get their heads out of their asses because they think
Yeah.
that they're the most hardcore of social sciences or whatever. When in reality they're just as much of a um they're just as much as um prone to like political bias or whatever
Yeah.
as like any of the social sciences or whatever, right? And I think like if economists get their heads out of their asses and stop being like so insular as you pointed out in your toxicity video,
Yeah.
and started working with like say sociologists, communication studies scholars, literature people, criminal blah blah blah, like all these different fields or whatever, right? It could be a really good way of critiquing how ideology works with an economic theory. How
I mean,
people
can I just
yeah
butt
go
in
ahead,
there
yeah.
because there's actually a separate issue. So we're talking about like the rhetoric of Econ 101, right, and the simplistic economics. And while, as I like to point out, that type of thinking doesn't necessarily reflect the economics discipline at large. There is there's a non-zero overlap. There are some economists out there, especially like the old guard, who are just like actually wedded to that, and people on the internet who are like they are actual economists who should really know better, but they fall back on this simplistic vision. But more to the point, when you talk about people who don't, the economists who don't, which I think is a growing majority, more so among young economists, they don't really necessarily buy into that simplistic vision, and they don't identify as free marketeers. Yeah, but they are fucking so bad at communicating their policy preferences. I mean, so we had Brexit.
Yes.
We had Brexit in here.
I'm so sorry.
In the UK, yeah, I know. And economists, what they basically universally just said was like, oh, according to our trade models, it's going to reduce aggregate GDP. And it's like, nobody gave a fuck. Because there were bigger issues at play, or what people believe to be bigger issues, which were about like things like national identity, freedom, and also as well there was the issue of inequality, which economists fail to realise, because it's like when you tell someone from Newcastle that they GDP is going to go down, they're like, well, we don't have GDP go up here anyway, so what are you going to Newcastle's in the northeast of England, by the way, in case you didn't know.
Gotcha.
So basically outside of London and close to London, similar to like rural America or something. It's like, where's all this GDP growth that you're promising us is meaningless to us, because, and just complete lack of understanding of those types of issues made economist rhetoric terrible during that campaign, and they failed to communicate it, and some of them kind of admitted it, but even afterwards, I go to economics conferences, unfortunately, and they're sitting there going, oh well, our forecasts were actually right. I mean, GDP has fallen. It's like, yeah, we fucking know that, mate. Like, stop congratulating yourself that you predicted that making a major movement to separate with one of the biggest trade blocks in the world was going to have a negative effect on GDP. Yeah, of course it fucking did. But like, you failed to communicate the point, and you should be reflecting on that instead of just like sitting there smugly talking about how right your forecasts were. And I just think economists don't have any sense of how to do rhetoric at all, or any sense that it would matter. Because if you ask them about their policy preferences, if you speak to them at like the pub, they'll be like, yes, a consumption tax could be welfare enhancing, and you're just like, that doesn't mean anything to anybody. You know what I mean? Like, and that's all they can do. They can just speak in those terms. Oh my god, mate, he fucks me up when he transforms.
Godfrey is a fucking beast.
Yeah, I'm not. I'm getting to the second phase most of the time, and I feel like I can do it. But It's just one of those. But yeah, anyway, yeah, economists like are really bad at rhetoric. I mean, you saw it just now. I mean, I was unprepared and I'm playing Elden Ring, but
No, yeah. No,
you know,
I
when
get
I
it.
tried to describe post-Keynesian economics, it was in quite kind of technical terms, and you know, to tell you the truth, I never thought of the idea of explaining post-Keynesian economics to somebody kind of, you know, outside of the economics discipline who isn't especially interested in it, you know, in abstract. I mean, all my followers, even if they're not economists by training, you know, they want to learn, so I can explain it in
Yeah.
those terms, and they'll be okay with it. But, you know, just explaining it to a quote-unquote ordinary person, or a normie, I should say,
Yeah.
hadn't actually crossed my mind. But obviously, if I'm a post-Keynesian economist who's trying to improve economics on the left and popularise those ideas, then I've got to think about it, right?
Yeah, it's all about like meeting people on their terms, right? And so, yeah, like with like a lot of British economists, we're talking all the time about like how, you know, leaving the EU will negatively affect the economy, and it's like, who fucking cares?
Yeah.
Like for like a lot of rural people, who fucking cares? About oh, speaking of conferences, my field has a national convention, the National Communication Association, and the deadline to turn them in was like back in like what was it, March?
Yeah.
I just got the notice that at least one of my papers got accepted. So cool.
Oh, congratulations.
Like just now. So cool.
Oh, literally
That's
just like as we're talking.
like literally like the notification of my Outlook just popped up as I was talking.
Hmm.
Cool. All right. So that means the schedule's probably up, so I'll have to check that when we're done.
Yeah.
So it's gonna be in New Orleans, and oh man, I love New Orleans. If you ever get a chance to visit any city in America, make it New Orleans. New Orleans is so fucking
Oh, really?
cool. Yeah, it's the coolest city on the planet. Yeah, there is no city on this planet that is, I don't know, at least America, that's more cool than New Orleans. So fucking cool. Um, but yeah.
Yeah.
So it's always meeting people on their terms, right? And that's the thing that I've had to work on the most, because I have this problem too, because I probably engage in more philosophy than most
Yeah.
people in my field. And so unfortunately that makes it hard for me to talk about like a lot of my policies in a way that people who aren't into like if I try to explain like, you know, hey, like Lacanian psychoanalysis or Zizekian philosophy to like the average person, they'll be like, what the fuck are you talking about, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so what I've had to do is I had to find ways to like, how do I make myself, and keep in mind that doesn't mean it's not because people are stupid. That's not what that means. What that means is that people don't have the training to like understand that particular language, and most people actually understand the general like argument and philosophy you're putting forward. They're just not using that same jargon you're using, right? And so you have to use what you know to speak on their level, right? Like to get them to understand what you're talking about. So if you're like, you know, an economist, you know, in England, and the fucking Brexit vote's about to happen, right? You don't talk about how it's going to negatively affect the GDP. You talk about how it's going to worsen their jobs.
Yeah.
How it's going to worsen like how job creation is going to be much harder for working class people, and how rural people and working class people are going to be fucked because it's going to make it harder for like, you know, for certain jobs to be created because immigrants will still come in regardless of what Nigel Farage was saying, right? They're still going to be able to get in here one way or the other, right? Because like in order to you know, have any type of trade agreement with other people, you have to have some type of entrance into the border. And so like it's like you talk like the economics you need to talk about isn't GDP. Because again, the only people who care about GDP are like the ultra wealthy and the state. Those are the only people who care about GDP. Like working class people are going to care about how are my wages going to affect me? How are my jobs going to affect me? Am I going to have a job? is my spending power going to be a thing that's still going to be relevant in the next 5 years, right? That's what they care about. And and from what you're telling me, that economists tend to be really bad at communicating that,
Yeah.
because the way they talk is that they make it seem as if like they're talking like like an economist for like a big company,
Yeah.
rather than economists for the working class.
Yeah, exactly. There's no notion of like how you would really communicate economics to the working class or even the middle class, to be honest with you, to just like anybody who's outside of economics.
Yeah, it's one of those things where um it how do I even put this? It's like it's one of those things where people identity is really everything. That's pretty much like the thing that every scholar or progressive scholar in general needs to know. That identity is everything. Everything is about identity. Everything is about like where do you fit within the broader society, right? Like
Yeah.
you have a bunch of like these white men in America, at least these incels, who are voting against policies that actively make their lives better because they care about their masculinity, right? They care about what makes them feel good, right? That's what, again, that's as I said before, that's what Reagan did, right?
Mm.
Reagan was able to look at the New Deal and be like, okay, sure, the New Deal made your life like objectively better in every way, shape, or form, but like, what about freedom, man? Right?
Yeah.
And that's where the paranoid, like apocalyptic conspiracy theorizing comes in, right? Is that you're able to take what's happening that's actually a good thing in America or the economy or whatever, and make it about the working class people and their identity, and trying to find, and to a certain extent, like Reagan was to a certain extent right about New Deal politics in a capitalist sense, right? Because like sure,
Mm.
like your economics are much better, but like it almost dehumanizes you in a way, right? Because you feel like you're just part of it. Like I don't know how common this sentiment is in England, but in America,
Mm.
Americans really don't like feeling like they're on an Excel sheet. They don't
Right.
feel like a number, right? I don't know if that's common in England, but it's definitely a thing in America.
Oh yeah, no,
And
I don't think anybody does, and there is like a, I mean, I'm a big fan of Seeing Like a State, the book by James Scott. I don't know if you ever heard of it, but
no,
says all it's libertarianism but correct. So
but
I mean, it's
correct, yeah,
anarchist libertarianism, right? And it's
yeah,
like, yeah,
yeah, correct.
you can like end up sort of treating people like numbers and kind of like not defining not dealing with people as individuals or as humans or what have you, right? And that's yeah, so there's kind of an element of truth in that. And I think when you talk about things like, I mean, you spoke about racism in terms of the New Deal, right? People are there were these top-down structures that were very bad for some people. They were bad for African Americans, but also there is a paternalistic aspect to it, right, as well. And you do
Yeah,
often see that with government programs and ones that focus on work and things like that. There is the people might not be treated that well because they are ultimately just it is just a matter of bureaucracy and of getting them from point A to point B, and then you can put it down on your tick box form as you've done your job if you work at the welfare office or whatever. So I guess there's an element of truth there, right?
yeah, there's an element of truth, but of course, what Reagan did was he took and that's what the right does, right? They take a general truth that's actually they point to a correct thing, but then they completely misdirect it to some culture war bullshit,
Yeah.
right? That what was it? Carlos Maza does a really good job where he kind of engages. He goes over Charlie Kirk's America First
Mm.
festival or whatever. But he had like some conference back in I think January.
Mm.
And he pointed out that there was one particular speaker at the event, and they were talking about cultural Marxism, because of course they were.
Yeah.
And one of the things I'm paraphrasing the guy, but basically what he said was, you have all these like corporations like Amazon and Walmart or whatever, and they virtue signal to like things like BLM, and they act like they support BLM and Black Lives Matter or
Mm.
whatever. But then all of a sudden you look at how they treat their employees and they exploit the shit out of their employees. So it's like they're not even like caring about what they say. And Carlos Maz is like, that's actually a good point. It's true. Corporations don't care about like the marginalized people because they only care about their bottom dollar, right? They'll talk about how they care about Black Lives Matter, but then they'll racially discriminate against black employees, or they'll
Yeah.
fire black employees when they try to unionize or
Yeah.
whatever, right? Right? They do all these crazy shit. And but then Carlos says, but this comes off as unhinged because the right doesn't give a shit about anything that they're talking about. They're only
Mm.
using it to get disaffected people to vote for them and then not do anything about it. It's like the gas prices, right? Like
Yeah.
conservatives in America talk about gas prices all the time and blame it on Democrats and Biden.
Mm.
But then Democrats in the House propose an anti-price gouging bill against oil and gas companies, and then almost every Democrat votes in favor of it, and every single Republican votes against it. Almost as if they want the problem to stay,
Yeah.
but they don't want it to go away because they keep blaming it on Biden, because they don't actually want to solve it, because in order to solve the problem, they would actually have to go after their donors.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I feel like I'm about ready to give up on Godfrey. Yep, I've just died. I mean, yeah, have we kind of covered everything you wanted to cover? Because I know you had a bit of a list of things you wanted to chat about. It's been really fun talking to you.
Yeah, no, that was pretty much it. Yeah. Actually, I'm actually gonna go eat some lunch with my mom. But
I'm
yeah,
going to go
yeah,
and eat some dinner. Yeah,
yeah,
been
that
talking a while.
oh yeah, yeah, because you're like way ahead of me.
Yeah.
You live in the future, man.
Well, I'm in 5:30. Yeah, I've got to. I'm in 5:30. It is 5:30. That shows you how tired I am. I've got to.
Yeah,
Yeah, I've got to start cooking at least. Anyway.
fair. But yeah, that was pretty much everything I wanted to talk about. Yeah, because like I think at least what I try to do, right? I can't speak for all rhetorical scholars. Is that what I
Mm.
try to do is I try to try to like branch out to different academic fields and try to advocate for sound like progressive policies through critiques of ideology.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And by understanding that a lot of the terms that are thrown around in debates are essentially not meaningless, but they don't really represent what they claim to represent, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah. Well, anyway, so thanks so much for coming on, and have a nice lunch with your mum. It's been great to talk to you.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to your next video, and I look forward to these Jordan Peterson simps fucking coping in the comments.
Yeah,
That's it.
yeah, me too. It will be soon. It will be within a week, I think.
Oh yes. All right. Well, you have a good
Okay.
day, man.
Thanks. You too. See you later. Okay, everybody. Well, yeah. God, I can beat Godfrey. I can beat him. I'm obviously reaching the point of tiredness and needing to eat. But yeah, thanks for bearing with me with all the technical issues this stream. I don't know, like I literally it's a microphone. It's plugged in. It's the same software I always use. It doesn't say I'm using mono on the Windows sound setting. It doesn't say I'm using mono on the OBS settings. By the way, that was a guy who goes by the name of Kinda Funny Rhetorician or Rhetorician. So yeah, anyway, I don't know what's going on with the whole left ear thing, but I'll definitely sort it out for next time. But thanks everybody. I know I was obviously doing those things. I was pretty unable to engage with chat. Yeah, you were having some interesting discussions about like queerness and the N word and reclaiming those and yes, some other interesting discussions. So thanks everybody, and I'll see you on Thursday. I've actually got another stream which is a chat, no Elden Ring, and then we might play a bit more Elden Ring at the weekend. But anyway,